Muslims all over the world celebrated Mawlid and Nabi, the birth of the Prophet Muhammad. It's a big celebration. You wouldn't have known about it from our papers, but there's always articles in there about the threat of Islamist extremism. Do we misunderstand Islam? Miriam Francois Sarah, do we misunderstand?
Well, I mean, clearly I think that we do misunderstand Islam. As a convert to the faith, I somewhat sympathise with a lot of the misconceptions that do abound, just because prior to my own investigation of the faith, I had quite a lot of negative perceptions myself. And it really does take some effort to get past sort of what's widely held to be truths about the faith to really understanding it. So I find that the misconceptions can vary from what I'd call the relatively innocuous, not realising that Allah is just the Arabic word for God and not the idea that Muslims somehow worship some sort of moon god, to you know, the sometimes sympathetic stroke, slightly patronising assumption that all Muslim women need liberation from Western feminists or even Western armies, through to, unfortunately, things like 51% of Britons polled thinking that Islam is responsible for, you know, the July 7th bombings. Yeah. So there's kind of a huge range of misconceptions in the broader we as a society, and then within the Muslim community there are a whole set of misconceptions, and I think...
And dangerous interpretations.
There are fringe movements.
It's part of the problem that it is the... You know, unlike the Bible, it is believed to be absolutely the received word of God to the Prophet Muhammad, and so... And some of the verses seem, to outsiders perhaps, to be pretty... unambiguous. You mentioned women there.
Yeah.
I mean, if I can just read out a couple on women. Surah 2:223. Your wives are your field. Go in, therefore, to your field as you will. And Surah 4:38. Men are in charge of women because Allah hath made the one of them to excel the other. Now,
I don't, so obviously you're reading a translation there, and the second translation...
The Rodwell translation.
Yeah, no, I certainly wouldn't agree with the way that the second passage has been translated. I don't find the first one hugely problematic, but certainly the second one...
How would you translate it? Because there are...
Well, the second one is men have to provide for women. That's according to Islamic law, that men have to provide financially for women. They are the breadwinners in the family. And so that's the basic agreement. There are basic premises. Now, within the basic premises, there can be variations on that. But that's the basic premise in the family, is that the husband is providing. But when I say sort of patronising, it is assumptions that sort of, you know, women in headscarves, you know, I often get asked the question, you know, does your husband make you wear that? You know, there's never the idea that maybe Muslim women choose to make these decisions for themselves. And certainly there isn't the understanding, like Sarah Joseph, the editor of ML magazine, recently wrote that for her, coming from the modelling agency, putting on the headscarf was her equivalent of what burning bras and shaving heads was to previous generations of feminists.
The headscarf is something, we've discussed it before, no doubt we'll discuss it again, about the general situation of Islam being misunderstood. Shiva, you were a political prisoner in Iran, weren't you, for 3.5 years. Is it down to the religion, or is it not down to the regime, some of the attitudes that you encountered?
Well, I think it's down to the religion when it comes to the power. I don't know why should I agree with your interpretation, because everyone can have their own interpretation.
Sure.
I don't think we misunderstood Islam. I think people who are against Islamic rules, they know because it brings inequality, especially when it comes to women's rights and children's rights. And also, it cannot tolerate any other people who does not believe in religion.
Well,
and
this
in
is
the other
absolutely
hand,
false.
and sorry, let me finish. And in the other hand, basically, people who are for Islamic laws, they know what they're doing. They're not extremists. I mean, when there's a difference between individuals believing, my parents are Muslim, they believe in Islam, but they're not for Islamic rules on the power. When Islam comes on the power, that's what happened. They issue fatwa. Look at Iran's and Afghanistan situation. Lots of examples that you can see there, that actually when Islam is there, I have read Quran. My parents are Muslim. I was proud of that. I know what it feels like to live under the Islamic laws. I've been in prison for the same reason. What was it like for you as a woman then?
Well,
as a woman,
and how did they justify it Quranically?
Well, despite what people think, Iran is not an Islamic country in a way. Many of them are Muslim, but they're not for Islamic laws. As a woman there, I was very young that I was kicked out of the school just because I wasn't wearing the hijab as they wanted me. It's not just that one. You see your parent, your mom, deprived from getting divorced because they don't get the custody of their children. I haven't seen my mom for 10 years. You know why? Because the government, according to Islamic law, the wife has to have the permission of the husband to get out of the country.
This is where differences of opinion come in, and
this is the problem, isn't it?
Well, no, we have to be clear here. There is variation within the Muslim community, and there are more extreme interpretations of Islamic law, and I condemn anybody who forces you to wear a headscarf, just as I condemn anyone who forces me to remove it. You cannot assume that everybody holds the Iranian interpretation of Islamic law. It's just not true.
Can I say something? There is a difference between you living in Britain, choose to wear hijab, and the law of the country, which is Islam. That's a total different. When you go like this on the street of Tehran, they would shoot you. That's not a choice. I'm sorry.
Okay, but you have to understand, I know that you're coming from the Iranian context. I work, for example, on Morocco, and most people don't realise that Morocco is technically an Islamic state.
But the state
it's technically an Islamic state. Yes, it's technically an Islamic state. It refers to Sharia. Every single law has to be passed through a body of ulama to be passed, and I'm sure many of you have enjoyed sun-filled holidays on the beach in Morocco and never thought twice about it. There is variation. You need to acknowledge
that.
Because there's a great, as usual, there's a disconnect. Islam is not what Muslims do. Why do we judge a religion by its practitioners? There are lots of mad Muslims, just there are lots of mad Christians, Jews and Hindus. I don't judge Christianity on the basis of what George W. Bush did in his 8 years as President of America. I don't see why Islam should be judged on the basis of what some Muslims do. And just to answer your specific question, which is Islam misrepresented in Britain? No doubt about it, and mainly by my colleagues in the misunderstood. Well, it is misunderstood because, unfortunately, my colleagues in the media make sure that's the case. You look at newspaper coverage of Islam today. There was a study done by Cardiff University. 2/3 of stories published about Islam and Muslims between 2000 and 2008 contain the idea that Islam was a threat, backwards, dangerous, or a source of problems. The most common adjectives used about Muslims in the press were extremist, militant, radical, fundamentalist, fanatic. It is open season on Muslims in the press. Journalists can now say things about Muslims that they would never dream of saying about blacks, gays, or Jews, and it is a scandal.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry, that's complete nonsense. Actually, the press dance around Islam. They won't say things about Muhammad that they would say about Jesus. They won't say things about Allah that they do say about Jehovah. They dance around Islam. They won't deal with it at all. My real problem, and I think the point I want to make, my real problem is, yes, as a society and as a government, we hugely and dangerously misunderstand Islam. Why? The reason why we misunderstand it, you'll have heard, everybody knows about the Preventing Violence Extremism. The government is pouring millions of my money and your money into this project simply to stop the violent extremists. Yet there are extremists, Muslim extremists out there who actually would make the BNP look quite reasonable people, and they're receiving money from our government.
Do you accept
Why? Because
the vast majority of Muslims
because our government is not understanding it.
Isn't that the key point?
I think
the vast majority of Muslims are not extremists.
Yeah.
The vast majority are not extremists, and yet we don't hear from the vast majority. Exactly. We hear on the front, perhaps you should pick up a newspaper, we hear on the front pages of the Mail and Express and the Sun, Anjum Chowdhury, who represents, what, 0.01% of Muslims? We don't hear from the majority who eschew violence,
we hear a huge amount from the Muslim Council of Britain. We hear a huge amount of the East London Mosque. No, they're not violent, but they are extreme. And
in your view, they're extreme. I think you're extreme.
I'm a normal wisdom. Let me finish my point.
I think you're both having to beg to differ with each other. I don't think you'll be having lunch after the programme. Shiva. Or maybe that would be the answer to things. Beverly, I know in a minute, but Shiva, you want to come back in?
Can I just give you a point? Can you give me an example that Islam come to the power and not abusing especially women's rights and human rights? I mean, I think you're mixing up individual right to believe in Islam and Islam as a state is two different things. I'm not against individual Islam. I'm saying wherever Islam comes to the power, that's what happened to people in Iran, Afghanistan and other
Okay, well that's an interesting question. Let me kind of rephrase that question for your views. Where in the world then is it best practiced in your mind?
Well, I think I'd just like to clarify that obviously we're looking at, in the Muslim world, primarily post-colonial states and third world countries. And third world countries generally don't tend to have the most open, liberal and free societies in which you are able to enjoy the rights that people enjoy in this society. So to apply the frame of reference that we have here, there is problematic. Now, I would
Malaysia,
say that
women are high up in Malaysia, aren't
there?
they?
There are many women in Parliament in Malaysia, and I think if we had some Malaysian or Indonesian female activists here, they'd certainly have a thing or two to say.
Can I ask you something about that, which is that just last week, 3 young girls between the ages of 17 and 25 were caned for having sex with their fiancés, actually.
There are feminist Islamic organisations in Malaysia and Indonesia campaigning against these sorts of punishments and saying that actually this is not the way to go about it, and this is not scripturally coherent. The model of the Prophet, peace be upon him, he was sent as a mercy to mankind. His model was somebody who was very kind, very soft, and not somebody who went around abusing people or being harsh to people. So certainly when we see this disparate between the way that it's practiced by Muslims and the way it's discussed by the text itself, it's clear that there is a misunderstanding.
Can I just ask you